Welcome to Crime Nation. This is the companion podcast for Crime Nation, the series, which airs Tuesday on the CW at 8 p.m. in the East. This is the place where we take you behind the headlines of some of America's most shocking crimes and give you the scoop on each episode. You'll hear exclusive clips, hear the stories that didn't make the show, and you'll meet the people that bring Crime Nation to life. You are here in Crime Nation.
Hey everybody, I'm Brian Enton, Crime Nation contributor and News Nation senior national correspondent. Today we're going to talk about the Brittanee Drexel case. It's such a terrible case. A young woman supposed to be on a spring break vacation in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. She ended up dead. I highly recommend the full Crime Nation episode to get up to speed on this case. There's been so many developments over the years. You can stream the episode for free now on the CW app. There's all sorts of new nuggets on the case, all the key players we got into the Crime Nation episode, interviews with police, family, pretty much everyone. So if you're not familiar with all the ins and outs, I highly recommend the Crime Nation episode. Again, it's free now on the CW app. But we're going to dig in a little deeper in this podcast. A little bit of the backstory. Brittanee Drexel's from Chile, New York. She went to Myrtle Beach on spring break. She was staying with friends. She had walked to another hotel and texted her boyfriend to say she was heading back to her motel. And that's the last time anyone heard from her. It's one of those cases where there was so much investigation. They were working on it apparently very, very hard, the police, but there were no developments for a long time until 2016. They actually had the wrong suspects at one point, which we're going to get into a little later in the podcast. And it didn't make a lot of sense. Listen to what one of the detectives said on Crime Nation early on.
On April 26, 2009, I was at my desk and I had one of the detectives come in with a patrol officer that had taken a report of a missing person. It's not uncommon to receive missing persons reports. Generally, they're resolved within 24 hours. But the detective saw that there was major concerns with this case. We found out that Brittanee Drexel was an athlete. She didn't drink. She was not a party girl. She wasn't promiscuous. She was in a relationship, and no one had been able to reach her. There was a lot of red flags. So we opened the case at that time. One of the first things that we did in the investigation is go to the Bar Harbor Hotel where she was staying. We were very, very concerned immediately because all of her clothes were there, everything was there. All she had with her was some money and her phone. So it was quite evident that she hadn't run away. And then we interviewed the girls.
The girls that Brittanee traveled down with told the police that Brittanee had connected with a whole bunch of other kids from Rochester that were down there. And the girls had gone off to do their own thing, so it was hard for them to really tell them what Brittanee Drexel had been doing.
The girls said they actually had very little to do with Brittanee because she's younger than they were. They did what they came to do. They went out and went places she couldn't go.
The ride down there was really difficult for me, very upsetting. Not knowing where Brittanee was, I think, was the worst. Your child just didn't disappear off the face of the earth. You know, where is she? There's so many things that go through your mind. Is she being raped? Is she cold? Is she dead somewhere?
You can imagine such an awful time for that family, wondering what happened. And so many years went by where they didn't know and just kept pressuring police, trying to figure out what happened to Brittanee. It was 2022 when police arrested Raymond Moody, a registered sex offender in the area. He was eventually charged with the murder, with kidnapping, with first-degree criminal conduct. He pleaded guilty to all of the charges. There's still a lot of questions about whether he's telling the full truth about what happened, but he did confess to the murder. And the detectives spoke about what a moment that was when they finally got the confession, how he eventually led them even to Brittanee's body. Take a listen to this clip from the Crime Nation episode.
I was shell-shocked. I was speechless. This guy is a monster. You know, I've arrested lots of people at this point in my career. Very few of them are actually pure evil. But we don't have a body yet, so we don't know if he's telling the truth. He's willing to fall on the sword. He did the crime. But Angel can't get charged.
I was with Dawn at the time that the FBI contacted her and told her that they may be able to recover Brittanee. We knew nothing about Raymond Moody or an arrest being made. The agent told Dawn that I may end up having to make a deal with the devil to bring Brittanee home. And what did Dawn want? What was more important to her? She wanted her daughter brought home.
So we get in the car. We drive into Georgetown until we got to just past his old apartment at the Sunset Lodge. He took us to a wooded lot. I asked him, does any of this look familiar? This is it right here. This is where I buried her.
And since then, there's been another arrest. The girlfriend of killer Raymond Moody, a woman named Angel Voss, was also recently arrested. I want to bring in investigative journalist Steph Watts, who has worked extensively on the Crime Nation episode, and also Jarrett Ferrantino, attorney representing Brittanee's mom, and also host of the podcast True Crime Boss, which is available on Spotify and YouTube. And Jarrett, by the way, I just found out is retiring right around the time of this podcast as a prosecutor. Homicide prosecutor, worked very hard for the last 20 years. So congratulations to you, Jarrett, on that.
No, thank you, Brian.
And I want to start with you, Jarrett, actually, just because obviously with all these cases, we want to remain victim focused, and everything Brittanee's family has been through is just awful. How are they doing today?
You know, their strength is inspiring. This tragedy, as long as the road to justice has really revealed how strong, in particular, Brittanee's mom, Dawn Drexel, is. She's been a shining example to women and to victims that have been unable to get answers in cases that go cold, to keep up the fight, keep up the public pressure, enlist your friends, get the help you need to get, and refuse to accept no answers, and refuse to accept explanations that don't add up. So they're doing well as they can be doing, because they have now had some closure. But at the same time, mourning the loss of Brittanee far too young.
Yeah, and you make a good point with a lot of the stories that we cover. It is family members just being noisy, being annoying, not giving up with the detectives, like not just sitting on the sidelines and expecting that all the work is being done behind the scenes, like really keeping the pressure on, which it's sad that it takes that, but it seems like it really does in a lot of these situations. Steph, I want you to bring us up to speed on the latest development, because there was a development really recently in this case, even after we had put together most of the Crime Nation episode, involving Raymond Moody's, I think it was his girlfriend, right?
Yes, so there's been a lot of speculation, rumors, and conversations about Angel Voss and her involvement in the crime. The problem with what's happening, Brian, is Angel and Ray have had since 2009 to corroborate their stories and come up with a story. But now Angel is being charged with 3 charges of lying to investigators. What Jarrett and I were talking about earlier, Brian, was we don't know what they presented to the grand jury that they whittled away, and we believe these are the lesser charges that they could get to stick. We believe that there was stronger charges against her, but the grand jury probably said, hey, there's not enough evidence for this, but they felt there was enough evidence to charge her with lying to federal investigators. And I think Jarrett can comment more on what those actual charges could equal to her in as far as jail time goes.
Yeah, Jarrett, tell us about that. And also, is this something you saw coming, and how does the girlfriend relate to the case? What do you think she knew? kind of walk us through that.
Well, as it relates to Raymond Moody, Angel Voss was a key witness. I mean, she basically kicked the door of suspicion open, which in the special we visit that. You see the statements she was providing to law enforcement. Unfortunately for Miss Voss, she misrepresented much of what she claimed to be the truth. These were provable lies, and when the investigators had the opportunity to run down Angel Voss's story, they found these provable lies, things regarding cell phone placement, disposal of evidence, which is why I think they're moving forward on these particular charges. They're just provable lies. And these investigators in particular, Brian, are some of the finest I've ever seen. They are just dogged after this case. They've taken this case very personally in a very good way. Because it's personally important to them to find out what happened to Brittanee. So that's why she's being charged with this. Now, notably, her statement was a proffer, and it is a violation of a proffer agreement to lie to the investigators. So whether or not more charges come against Angel Voss, well, time will tell. But the first sign of trouble for her is the fact that she's lied to the investigators and she's now charged.
Yeah, and you make a good point about how hard the investigators have been working, because they could have just said, we got Raymond Moody and this has been a long time coming and, let's move on. But they're clearly still working the case. Is this something, Jarrett? I mean, did you know this was happening behind the scenes? Did the family know? Is this something that they were sort of waiting on?
Yes, we were aware that the investigation was ongoing. We have met with the investigators pretty regularly throughout this process. And we remained hopeful. The information Angel provided just didn't add up. I mean, she was a total babe in the woods, literally a babe in the woods in this case, claiming Brittanee was taken to this campsite by Ray and whoops, she just happened to disappear. And when she came back, Brittanee was gone. Those statements aren't credible. They were enough to get Moody where he needed to be. There were just so many open questions about Angel and her role. So Dawn certainly had those. The investigators certainly had those. And they were certainly assuring us that if it could be shown that she misrepresented her version of events and lied, she would face consequences.
With so many of the cases that we cover, the killer is sometimes someone that the victim knew, or there was some kind of argument that happened at one point, or there's this whole backstory. With this, I mean, it was really a random killing. It's not like Brittanee knew her killer. And I think that's one reason. I mean, she was just supposed to be in Myrtle Beach having fun and just this beautiful young woman. And I think it's like everyone's worst nightmare when something like that happens. Steph, if you can walk us through again Raymond Moody's motive, like what actually went down that led to him, killing Brittanee.
Sure. Well, remember, Brian, the details of what happened are coming from a controlled narrative from, Angel Voss and from Raymond Moody. But you're correct. I think Raymond Moody was stranger danger, as he was in his previous crimes back in LA, back in California. From as far as we know, that Brittanee was walking home, and we have to remember, Brian, she had to be somewhere. Friends were waiting for her to return some clothing items. Apparently, Raymond Moody and Angel pulled up and asked Brittanee if she wanted to party with them, and she said yes and willingly got into the car. Brian, that's where the story kind of falls apart, and the million-dollar question. Did Brittanee Drexel get in that car willingly, or was she forced in that car? Brian, if you look at Raymond's history and his MO, we don't believe that Brittanee Drexel willingly got into that car. So that's kind of the information that we're still waiting on. Tomorrow, there's a briefing with the FBI and the family that Jarrett and myself are going to be privy to some of the details of that meeting that we'll be happy to share with you what we can. But that's as far as we know. And the rest of the, they've had since 2009 to control the narrative. We know she did go to the boat landing, and then we know that she was buried at the location where her body was recovered. The rest of the details, Brian, are really, really muddy and murky. And that's what makes this case interesting. Everybody wants to know What happened in that car? What happened on that ride from Myrtle Beach to the pole landing? We don't know, but we're hoping to find out.
Yeah, and you make such a good point that we're only hearing one version of what happened. And Jared, it really doesn't make a lot of sense that Brittanee would just get in a stranger's car like that. But I guess we may never really know the full story. I mean, you've been a homicide, I mentioned at the top, you've been a homicide prosecutor for 20 years. Like, why would a killer admit to a killing, but then lie about details along the way? I mean, if you're going to admit to the killing and you're going to go away for life or whatever, why not just tell the full story?
Well, so to answer your first question, Brian, what do I think about Brittanee getting in that car? I could say this. Brittanee was immediately separated from her phone. So the second she got in that car, that phone, she stopped texting her friends, she stopped communicating, which means she was separated from that phone, which in my opinion, and in my experience shows she did not willingly get in that car. She was taken, she was forced into that car and immediately separated from any communication outlet to the outside world. That's the way I look at it. That's the view I see. And then your next question of why would somebody admit to murder and then lie about these, possibly lie about these collateral details? I have seen that so many times. You really can't apply logic to an illogical situation. For whatever reason, Moody, in his mind, wants the world to think he didn't randomly grab her, wants the world to think it played out a little bit to the fault of Brittanee. Okay, it's a victim blaming shift too. It's like basically, this mouse found her way into the lion's mouth. That's not the case. So it's a little bit of blame shifting. He's using that version of events also to protect Angel, because if he admits he grabbed her and pulled her into the car while Angel's in the car, she's a co-conspirator to kidnapping and murder.
Brian,
Yeah.
one thing, if I could jump in, Moody has always said that they lured her into the car by smoking and wanting to smoke marijuana, smoke pot. I've spoken extensively to Brittanee's soccer coaches, really close friends, family members. Brittanee not only didn't like marijuana, she couldn't stand the smell of it. She wouldn't even date a guy or be around people who partook in marijuana. Anything else beyond that, we don't have details on. But as far as him saying she got in the car to smoke marijuana, we know that to be a lie, because Brittanee Drexel did not use marijuana, and that's been fact checked, right, Jared? Like, from everybody that knows her. So that,
and what Jared said about the phone too, that just doesn't. I mean, why would she be separated from the phone at the moment she went in? She would have, if she went in willingly, she would have brought her phone. I mean,
Brian, that second, she was separated that second. We have it down to the seconds of when that window, when she was picked up, she literally, Brittanee Drexel was a mad texter, just like every 17-year-old kid.
Yeah.
She would respond. We have those texts within seconds to her boyfriend, to her friends. So all of that would suggest to me she did not get in voluntarily. And Moody has a tremendous amount of motivation to lie about that part of the story. At that point, he's saying the gig's up for me. I got to throw a little BS in there to protect Angel.
And
Makes
Brian,
sense.
if you look at his MO back at the Carrie Harding, he was kidnapped back in California. Jared, what year was that? That was in what was that?
It was in the 80s, I believe.
Back in the 80s, which he was sentenced to 40 years, only served 20. Carrie talked specifically about being snatched off the sidewalk and thrown into the car. So I think Ferentino will agree with me. If you look at a horse's track record, if that's what he did to Carrie, how do we have to assume that's probably the same thing he did to Brittanee. Jared, agree or disagree?
Yeah, and I think too, if you look back at the narrative that Angel was giving, that Moody had these, in her first statement to the police, she was talking about these dark, twisted fantasies about Moody kidnapping a young girl and taking her there. That's not only is it part of his MO, it's part of his, we call it the 404B character evidence in Pennsylvania. Basically, it's part of his modus operandi. It's like I always talk about the sticky bandits or the wet bandits in Home Alone. They have this signature component of their crime. His fantasy is to grab a young girl off the street, rape, and kill her. Well, we know that Brittany was raped. We know that she was killed. It's not that much of a leap of faith to assume the third component of that fantasy was meted out.
Jarrett, how important is it to Brittany's family to get the real story? Because obviously there was relief, I'm sure, when Moody was arrested and confessed, and at least there's got to be some peace, I guess, knowing that her killer is behind bars. But is it important to them to get all of these details? Is that something that they want?
Well, no, they know the truth. They know she wouldn't have gotten in that car voluntarily. So the fact that they're getting lies from Raymond Moody at this point, I would say they in their heart know Brittany would not have done that, regardless of what Moody says. Now, whether or not there is some provable component of how Brittany was forced into that car, would they have some additional closure if they were shown that information? Yes. Is there a desire to know as much as they could possibly know, to know what happened to Brittany that night? Yes. But at the same time, Brian, they're well aware that Brittany would not have voluntarily got in that car. And that's a self-serving statement because they have all the motivation in the world to say it that way.
Yeah, and it just doesn't really doesn't make sense. Yeah, sorry, Steph, what were you going to say?
No, sorry to jump in. I wanted to tell you, I've spoken in details with Don, as has Jarrett, and I know Don is certainly disappointed with the charges being lying to investigators. Jarrett, you can agree, but Jarrett's really explaining to Don that's the charges that the grand jury could stick. Don was hoping for her to be charged with, the kidnapping or murder, but unfortunately, from the information we have, they just didn't have the evidence to be able to charge her with those charges. Correct, Jarrett?
Well,
no,
I don't want to comment on that part of it.
Well,
yeah, I guess this part is that I'm glad we're talking about this though, because this part is all still very much evolving, and it's one reason.
Well, here's the thing: whether or not they have the evidence, Steph, it may have been presented to the grand jury. It may be continuing to be presented to the grand jury. She's going to be given an opportunity to speak after these charges come down. So I would only say that certainly Don Drexel believes Angel Voss's role was significant in Brittany's kidnapping and death. And she is hopeful that the truth, all of the truth comes out, and every applicable charge that Angel Voss can face is levied against her.
Don believes, Brian, and we all believe that Brittany wouldn't have approached that car or gotten into that car if Angel Voss wasn't in that car. That's, we haven't proven that.
That made her feel more comfortable because it was a female.
Right.
You think?
Yeah, that's Jared. Do you want to comment on that?
Well, if she wasn't forcefully taken into the car, one possible version is that Angel's presence was used to allay any fears that anyone they were approaching would have. So yes, but my feeling though is that she was grabbed.
Okay, yeah, that seems like it would make the most sense.
Also, Brian, the presence of a second person, not as a ruse, but as an assistant. If Brittany's fighting in the vehicle, somebody has to be driving the car. You need two people.
Right.
You very rarely have that kind of crime. It's a two-person, it's a two-person crime, the way this played out.
Yeah. That totally makes sense. Another sort of fascinating part of the episode, because obviously we're talking about, the girlfriend's now been arrested, Angel, and Raymond Moody's behind bars, and there's, closure in that way, but it's been a long road to get here. And one of the parts of the episode that I thought was the most interesting was this whole situation with Timothy Taylor and Tom Taylor, wrongfully accused of this. Can you explain, Steph, how all of that went down?
Yeah, if I can just kind of back up a little bit, Brian, I think the most compelling part of the show was when we hear from Raymond Moody and we hear him say, I wish those boys had have gone down for the murder.
Yeah.
That was just, I'm sure you heard that. That just gave me chills, right, Ferentino, to actually hear him say that, he wished that they went down. It's, Jared and I don't 100% agree on this, but I think it was some good old Southern racism. I think that there was some evidence that did point them towards the Taylors. I think that they really jumped the gun on charging Timothy. I think that there wasn't the evidence, but he did go off of a jailhouse snitch who was a young man of color who said he saw Brittanee Drexel in this stash house. He saw her gang raped, shot, and rolled up in a carpet and removed from the house. So they had a credible single source, but I felt like they, and maybe Ferentino will agree with me on this, they went too hog wild on the charges based on only the evidence of a jailhouse snitch. And they said they were going to corroborate the story with other witnesses, and we never heard from them. We never heard from second, third sources on that fact.
Yeah, go ahead, Jared. What were you going to say, Jared?
Well, they weren't charged with the murder and kidnapping of Brittanee. It was alluded to in some information that was provided. What the government did was recharged one of the Taylors with a crime that he had already pled guilty to in an effort to basically aid him into providing information on the Drexel case if he had it. So they used, which is a tactic that's employed in prosecution. The thought is basically levy these charges, put Mr. Taylor in a position where he has to now talk and he has motivation to speak about what happened to Brittanee Drexel. And he had no truth to offer. He was not involved in her case. So you can squeeze him as hard as you want. You're not going to get what happened to Brittanee unless you were eliciting a false confession from him. And you know, this thing played out. It was just like the way the Taylor inferences and the way that information came out in this investigation was so unfortunate. It really was. Ultimately, there was testimony in a courtroom disclosed to a judge regarding the new charges against Mr. Taylor, and it was said that jailhouse informants had provided credible information that he may have been involved in the disappearance of Brittanee Drexel, and the press went wild, and it became just a huge dark cloud over Mr. Taylor and his entire family, to the point where his dad was willing to come forward and confess to killing Brittanee Drexel to take the pressure off.
I mean, that is wild. Just unbelievable. And they're now suing, aren't they?
Yes, they filed a civil claim against the federal government, against a host of defendants as a result of, you know, just the ill repute that fell upon them as a result of these charges. And you know, their names were dragged through the mud. They had to defend themselves on national television. This was such a terrible mystery and horrific story that the public was looking for someone to blame, and the Taylors were just fed to the masses and bore all that blame. Meanwhile, Mr. Moody sat back hoping that the Taylors would go down and he would get away with what he did.
Yeah, I mean, that's a sick and twisted part of it. And like you said, Steph, the fact that he said he hoped that they would end up going down for it and that you could just sit back and watch someone else be blamed is really next level awful. Jarrett, did Brit at that time, when people believed that they did it, did Brittanee's family and mom feel like relief, like they got the right people, or did they have doubt?
Well, Brian, the one thing was just the nature of how this crime was claimed to have gone down with regard to the Taylors, that Brittanee was shot, gang raped, shot, and then fed to alligators. I mean, the trauma of losing a child this way and not having answers, and then getting answers that if you saw this in a movie, you would be blown away. So Dawn was traumatized by that description, quite honestly. And it came out, and there was no additional information. At some point, the trail with regard to the Taylors went cold. So she was left more confused and traumatized by the version of events that was provided to her. So it went from partially clarifying with a version of events to getting far worse for her. And that let me say this, that created a severe breakdown of trust between Dawn and the authorities investigating the case.
Well, I would imagine. Yeah, I mean, it sort of throws off the trust component there for sure.
Absolutely. And yeah, you know, she's still to this day, which is why I came into the picture through Steph had introduced Dawn to me. And I came to represent Dawn as a prosecutor and as an attorney, basically as a translator, assisting her with processing what the new team was telling her, because her trust in the system had been so shattered. She wanted to bring her own prosecutor with her to kind of just be next to her, translate what was being told to her. And that's what my role was. And I immediately recognized just a passion, a knowledge, an expertise in this particular group. I didn't know the prior group, that I was repeatedly reassuring Dawn that I had tremendous faith in what I was seeing, and very hopeful that ultimately Mike and Caleb and those guys were going to solve this case.
Well, it makes sense why Dawn would feel like she would need an advocate of her own based on everything she had been through with the police up to that point. So that makes perfect sense. It's good that you were able to be there for her.
She felt like she needed me. Don Drexel doesn't need anybody to fight her fight. I can tell you that.
Yeah, well, that's pretty. Yeah, I mean, that comes through in the show too. I mean, the way she's been a fighter since the very beginning, which goes back to sort of what families have to do to really. I mean, if she hadn't pushed so hard, would we really be where we're at today with this case? So
I wonder.
Yeah, so is she? I mean, I think you're involved probably too. Is she now suing? She's suing Raymond Moody, right?
Well, now I'm not licensed down there, so she has a claim filed against Mr. Moody, the hotel, on some different theories about how there was a negligence breakdown, and certainly Moody's involvement in the case. But those are civil claims out of the criminal realm, and they're filed in South Carolina. So they are pending, but I'm not representing Dawn on those particular issues.
And I guess that's just more of her trying to get more facts, just hold more people accountable that in terms of the motel that led up to this.
Yeah, I mean, look, this is a tragedy all the way around, and if there's others in addition to Mr. Moody who bear some blame, then the civil claim is going to meet that out.
Steph, with Angel, the Moody's girlfriend, now facing these charges, and obviously they're in, as Jarrett said, that's ongoing, and maybe there'll be more charges. We'll see. I mean, do you think that this is the end, that we're at the end finally of this nightmare for the family, for Brittanee's family? Or, I mean, all about this case. Are there more little tentacles out there, other people involved?
I think what will come out is some of the details of what led to these charges. Brian, I think, and Jarrett and I have talked about this in extent, it's one of those situations, Brian, that I don't know if we're ever going to know exactly what happened that night, every detail. And I also don't know if we want to know exactly what happened that night. But the saddest part of this story, Brian, is they had Moody under the radar. The day after Brittanee Drexel disappeared, he was pulled over for a motorcycle, for speeding on his motorcycle. He was wearing one of those old helmets. He had scratches on his face, as Ernie Merchant told us. And back then, Brian, he wouldn't have come up as a registered sex offender. He would have, the officer that pulled him over wouldn't have had that information in his vehicle as they do now. He would have called it in. The operator would have had it. They just didn't connect the dots. Here they were in this small town. They had a missing girl. They were looking for a killer or a kidnapper. Here was a registered sex offender, and nobody connected the dots, Brian. And what I always think about, and Jared and Don and I have talked about, how many times has he done this since April of 2009? I can't imagine that this is the last time that Raymond Moody murdered a young girl. You can't tell me that he stopped at Brittanee Drexel.
Yeah, it does make you wonder. I mean, that why he would do it just this one time. But I'm glad that Brittanee's family is finally getting some of the answers. Like you said, they might not get all the answers. I really appreciate you both, Jarrett and Steph, for taking the time to talk to me and being part of the Crime Nation episode. And this is a case, some of the cases we cover, they're kind of just over. I think this is one that we'll all have to continue to keep an eye on, because it sounds like there's a lot of moving parts still. So thank you both so much.
Thanks, Brian.
Thanks for being a part of Crime Nation for this episode of the podcast. Don't forget to watch the show, which airs Tuesdays on the CW at 8 p.m. Eastern. This has been Crime Nation, the podcast.